Hello everyone. Um, I wanted to make this video and give you some remarks about the concepts of readings that we are encountering in this unit. As you may know, the first unit basically is an introduction to human rights discourse, and it aims to give theoretical aspects and contemporary perspectives regarding this field in political theory and philosophy. As you may know, there is an ongoing contemporary debate on human rights, and the general consensus at the moment is that human rights are a set of norms, both legal and moral, that guide the conduct of governments. The debate then focuses primarily on how to understand these norms and the basis upon which they are justified and the implications, duties, and obligations these norms impose. While the goal of all the following theories is the same, namely to find an intellectual ground for human rights that can command reasoned loyalty, there is a remarkable amount of variety in the answers to the fundamental questions. Um, Leaving all these different theories aside for this moment, as I said earlier, the doctrine of human rights can be summarized as an articulation of the idea that each person is a subject of moral and legal concern. It doesn't matter what a person's geographical location might be, or which religious or political subdivision, or social or ethnic group the person might belong to. Everyone has human rights based on the simple fact that we're all humans, and the responsibilities to protect these rights may in principle extend across political and social boundaries. There are four general types of duties linked to the principle of respect for basic human rights, and they can roughly be subdivided into four clusters. The first group are a set of negative duties, and these duties basically force us to refrain from infringing on basic rights by our own actions. That means like killing or injuring innocent people. The second group is the positive duties to secure the basic rights of the people we are responsible for. That is, supplying food to people who cannot provide it for themselves when we have been identified as the responsible agents. To be clear, these first two groups are an inherent normative background on which every contemporary Western liberal society rests upon. So, if you want to have a simple identification, an analogy with some of the more familiar aspects we all share, for example, legal system. Uh, Legal system sanctions any kind of behavior or actions of individuals or the group of individuals that result in harm towards other innocent people. So, for example, if you hurt someone intentionally and the injury is severe, or even like take extreme cases like murdering someone or violating the personal or bodily freedoms of person, like raping someone and so on, your behavior will be sanctioned. You will probably end up in jail, or even worse, depends on which state you live. The second group refers more towards the actions of governments. So, one example will be when we face something like a natural disaster. So, recently we had these hurricanes on the East Coast, or if you want to go more historic, they're like Hurricane Katrina, where basically government is responsible for providing aid and support to people who are deprived of these basic necessities. The third group is the group of the positive duties to prevent rights violation by other parties. That is, like intervening to prevent genocide or some lesser abuse of human rights. Um, in recent, like 2 decades, there are like few examples of humanitarian intervention. The first one was basically in Iraq in 1991, then former Yugoslavia in Bosnia and Kosovo in 1995 and 1999. Then, of course, the wars against terrorism, 2003, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there are different ways how governments and the multilateral organizations like United Nations try to deal with governments that are basically infringing or violating human rights of their own citizens. Like, for example, we have now the conflict in Syria where our government actively supports one side that is basically fighting against the official government. The fourth set of duties is the positive duty to secure the basic rights of people when others have failed in their responsibility. That is, supplying food to people who are themselves responsible for their condition or towards whom third parties have failed in their duty of aid. So, if we have famine in developing parts of the world, for example in Africa, and when we have as a consequence of a military conflict, a huge number of displaced people who needs to be supported in some kind of way. Although Western societies are not directly responsible for their current state of deprivation, there is a humanitarian obligations to help these people and provide necessities that will enable them at least to survive to some extent until the conflict in their own countries has subsided. The relative importance of each of these four duties is of descending weight, of course, and varies considerably according to their moral stringency, whereas negative duties clearly fall on all agents, individual or collective. In the case of positive duties, there is a substantive question about whose responsibility it is to provide the resources needed to secure basic human rights. These clusters of duties help us address the question of what each of us individually owes to other human beings, regardless of their cultural and social setting. We know that physically injuring people or abusing them in ways that destroy their dignity and self respect makes it impossible for them to live adequately, no matter what their particular aims and values turn out to be. But our obligations are not exhausted by our duty to refrain from actions that threaten people in this way. We also have obligations to provide help to those persons who are not in position to secure these basic necessities on their own. Because of the universality of the question of human rights, this whole discourse is part of a political, philosophical, social, anthropological discipline called global justice. Global justice basically denotes two different concepts. At one side, justice is a regulative standard of human interaction, and it is grounded in the concepts of fairness, equality, and reciprocity. Global in this term means that it is not bounded within a particular country and its institutions, and rather unfolds worldwide. Broadly speaking, there are three different interpretations of the concept of global distributive justice. The first is grounded on the suspicion that justice can be confined only to national context, where it can obtain among people who are subject to the same sovereign power that, through a legal coercive system, coordinates fair distribution between duties and merits. And this is so-called liberal nationalism thesis that is supported by Thomas Nagel, whose article we are encountering in this unit. The second argument sees global justice as an extension of principles that are characteristic for particular liberal social nation states. This view advances the point that global justice should be understood more or less in terms of a global principle of equality of resources and opportunities, and it is underlined with the cosmopolitan idea that no individual or group has a natural or cultural entitlement to any specific level of affluence. This is statement supported by people who denote themselves as cosmopolitan philosopher, and few names that we'll encounter in this course, like Henry Shue and Thomas Pogge, are their main representative at this moment. There is one more group that basically mediates between first two, and It asserts that obligations of justice also obtain outside the context of a particular state, but they are fundamentally different from the principles that are effective upon the domestic level. Um, One of the main academics who basically support and advance this claim is David Miller, and we'll talk more about David Miller in third unit. This moment, I just want to give a brief explanation what his thesis consists of. So, at one side, he agrees with position of um, Thomas Nagel that the question of justice are confined within the particular national context of specific countries that are regulated by uh, their government, security apparatus, economical systems, and so forth and so on. But he also claims that certain aspects of the global condition, so for example, deprivation of people who live elsewhere, um, may result in obligation towards the Western countries that will basically place them in a position to provide and be responsible for providing this such aid simply based on the fact that they have capacity to do so. Uh, Most people who reflect on these dynamics, like taking all these three major approaches to the question of global justice and human rights fulfillment, are torn between a moral commitment to the equal standing of every person regardless of social or cultural differences, and a deeply entrenched obligation to prioritize the needs of a subset of humankind that we happen to be associated with in one way or another. The attempt to reconcile these two commitments must address the question that underlies both the morality of global justice and that of national identity. Namely, are these two perspectives in tension with each other? And if yes, how should we allocate the weight of obligations that each outlook emphasizes? So, with this said, I would like to give some few remarks on the two readings that basically try to give you a short introduction into global justice discourse, how it unfolds with these two extremes. So, um, the first article Henry is written by Henry Shue. He's a British philosopher and political theorist. It's called Mediating Duties. There are basically few problems that this article aims to address. If you take a look on the first page, I think that's page 687, he already tries to establish the guidelines that will lead his argument. First of all, the concept of human rights basically denotes the conditions that every person demands fulfillment of certain standards in order to be able to lead a minimally decent life. Now, this by itself is not a controversial claim. We all need these basic necessities in order to survive. But the problem is that provisions of these necessities demand certain kinds of sacrifices from our side, and not many people are ready to do that. So, what does Xu say about the contemporary distribution of resources? And this statement can be found in the middle of the main paragraph. First, the human population is large and it's ever increasing, it increases every year. The planet is rich in resources, so that means that the Earth still can enable provision of these basic necessities to every human being that basically lives. And finally, the third aspect is that human control over resources and, let's say, wealth is uneven. Many people control no significant resources, and a minority of people control the vast majority of the known resources. So, what is the consequence of this? Well, basically, there's a huge gap between the poor and rich. While the poor make the vast majority of population that lives today, um, they cannot provide some of their basic necessities without support of the rich minority. The second main aspect of his argument is that Shu wants to address the connection, or lack of the same, with strangers, with people that are not directly part of our lives. How to justify our support and care towards those people that are evidently not part of our community or country, but that are nonetheless in need of our help. And the third aspect is that the main problem that this article addresses is how to establish and justify the commitment to provision of these universal rights, even if they demand substantive investments from persons and institutions that are not directly involved in human deprivation elsewhere. His first step is to reject the weight of the distinction between negative duties and the positive rights. Um, Namely, the main argument about priority of negative rights is that they don't demand any kind of action from agents involved. That is, as I already said earlier, the negative duties consist in merely omitting certain kinds of actions like violence, crime, etc. It doesn't involve any substantial sacrifice from our side. Positive duties are different. They mean that we are supposed to provide resources to other people, that is, to provide food, water, medical supplies, and any other kind of aid that they might need. This standpoint affirms that the moral urgency of providing sufficient resources to keep the endangered individuals above some threshold of decency. The decency that I have in mind here, and Shu has in mind here, includes recognition and provision of needs that every human being has as a biological and social creature. A simpler way to outline this position will be to point out the idea that a decent human life contains certain essential components that are repeatedly occurring in all societies. According to these universal elements, we can identify vital human needs whose precise form will nonetheless be context related to the particular social horizons in question. So, the nature of these um, needs that are manifested in that basically create positive duties and give entitlements to people are necessary in order to draw up a sensible account of human rights. And it has to answer a simple question: what do we require to function minimally as living beings? Thus, in order to draw up a sensible account of human rights, we must have a sense of what we require to function minimally well as the kinds of creatures we are. We must have an account of our basic needs in order to draw up a coherent and comprehensive list of our basic entitlements and protections. Human needs in this sense offer an informational background for any plausible and practically defensible account of human rights, because they address the material and social conditions that are necessary to remain alive and in reasonable comfort. The justification procedure of grounding human rights in an account of human needs as intrinsic elements of human life has a number of desirable qualities. First, needs discourse is insensitive to cultural pluralism in the contemporary world. It appeals to every person regardless of their her cultural settings and social commitments. It highlights the universal aspects that are essential for every human being in order to live adequately. And they have enormous motivational force. Their applications resonate extraordinarily well with our basic moral intuitive judgments when confronted with human suffering in general. We are simply not indifferent looking at a child that is starving or sick. Um, what I have in mind here is the idea that human rights, taken and understood as protection of these basic necessities that every human being has, should provide a framework that will demand their enforcement as a moral imperative, distinguishing them from other claims that are incapable of imposing strong enough obligatory duties. The needs in this case provide the background that is essential to human life qua human beings, and that they intuitively possess the moral urgency to be fulfilled. The second article that deals with global justice within this unit is completely opposite understanding of obligations that human rights and global justice in itself um, make upon agents, especially in Western affluent countries. So, The Problem of Global Justice is a very influential article written by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel. And the main idea of Nagel's article should be understood primarily as a counterposition to the Shoe's position. It doesn't address a demand to respect and protect basic human interests whose violation will trigger the responsibility to provide aid as much as deals with motivation and justification to do so. Here we have a person that claims that the concept of justice is limited to a particular sovereign power manifested in a single state. Sovereign power has certain features, for example, groups of people that are bound through a single legal system, through certain institutional structures that create sealed organisms with internal coercive powers like police, army, legal system, educational system, economical system, etc. And of course, clear and internationally accepted territorial boundaries. The main rationale of this account is that questions of justice manifest as demands of reciprocity, equal political and social standing, and justifiable discrepancies involved can be monitored and controlled only within an organized coercive unit manifested through a legitimate government and state apparatus. This standpoint doesn't deny the moral urgency of providing sufficient resources to keep the endangered individuals above some threshold of decency, but tries to diminish the range of responsibility to do so. It confines the concept of global justice and justice in general only to an internal structure of a particular society, leaving the international relations to be a matter of diverse political and economic contracts. As we will see, he doesn't deny the usefulness of institutions that are multinational and that the sole purpose is to deal with questions of aid, but he doesn't see that as a matter of justice. He still understands it as a utopian project that can achieve its realization only by creating a single institutional coercive structure for the whole world. As it seems, this will not happen in the near future. Therefore, all our endeavors are merely humanitarian in nature, and we don't share direct responsibility for strangers that are not connected with us in any important sense. For him, the globalization and its effects are the product of a bargain, and the inequalities are more or less justified because of different social and economical contexts that different contract partners, in this example states, share. We will discuss more on blog what are the problems with both of these accounts, but at the moment I will like to summarize the contrast between Henry Shue and Thomas Nagel. The basic difference between these two philosophers lies in their understanding of a moral concern, namely, there are monistic and pluralistic contexts of moral appropriation. The monistic context reflects that every single person has equal moral worth, regardless of cultural, ethnic, racial, and religious differences. The pluralistic context claims that some persons have priority and that they demand more of our attention, and this priority can be grounded basically in national ties, cultural ties, affiliation ties, etc. Nagel's differences with Shue. First, the distance of people in need does matter. National ties do matter. The circular notions of responsibility are valid and justified. If you can recall from Henry Shue's article, he basically says he wants to criticize and abolish this understanding of responsibility that is basically circular, that people who are closest to us and whom are we tied with based either on religious, ethnic, cultural, or any other kind of forms of ties and bonds should not be prioritized than any other person who lives elsewhere and who we don't even know personally. To go back to the Nagel's differences to Shue, following claim that there is no justice outside national borders basically claims that questions of justice, wealth, resources, power are basically just part of free-for-all game. And final aspect that I identified as the major difference between these two thinkers is that Nagel thinks that globalization is a game of bargaining. It doesn't place responsibilities on us, that means Western affluent countries, in the sense that we have to limit our own interests in order to help other people. That doesn't mean that we need to exploit other societies, of course. I don't think he will like to make that kind of claim. Um, there are also similarities with Xu. First one of them is that both accept notion of human rights, although they vary in their range of application. If you can recall these four groups of duties, while Xu is defending all four groups, Nagel defends only first two that are basically confined to the national environment of a particular country. And the second one, both highlight the role of institutions in dealing with these issues. So institutions that aim to provide aid to people in need are usually multinational institutions like United Nations and all these diverse multilateral and multinational non-government organizations that are supposed to provide direct aid and support to people that are deprived. So in order to summarize this Unit 1 and the question of these kind of introductory notions tied to the human rights discourse and the concept of global justice, we have identified that there are like four general types of duties linked to the principle of respect for basic human rights. We have also learned that there are different concepts of global justice. We have learned what the nature of these positive duties is and what is the importance and their claims for universality. We have also then switched to the questions of global justice and we introduced these two opposite accounts, while Xu's understanding of responsibility for the support and aid of people in need, regardless of distance and communal ties, makes very strong claims upon human agency and actions of governments. The basic features of Nagel's account, on the other hand, sees justice as a feature of particular society with its coercive apparatus and authority, and everything else is just a case of humanitarian aid and not question of justice. And finally, we have summarized the differences and similarities between these two thinkers. I hope this is helpful. If not, you can always send me questions for additional clarification. Of course, I will keep on posting on blog on a regular basis. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.